This evening I want to talk about the problem of employment. I think all of us recognize that one of the daily problems we have is that of making a living. Now, we can make this living either by working for ourselves or by working for someone else. All of us have the problem and the necessity of working for a living or laboring. Now, if we don't do that, then we have more stressing problems. And they come as a result of not working or not laboring or not making a living. And so what might be a problem to one individual can become a blessing or a preserver of life to others. It's on to how you look at it. Now this evening I want to look at, think about it from the necessity of labor as taught in the Bible. Secondly, man needs employment for his own good. And third, what are some of the characteristics of a good worker, a good employee? All right, in the first place, let's consider that the Bible teaches the necessity of labor. When God placed man and woman in the Garden of Eden, in Genesis 2:15, he said, he took them there, he took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. I've run into people through the years that think that work was the curse that God placed upon man when he committed sin. No, work wasn't the curse that placed upon man. God had already placed man in the garden to dress it and to keep it. The labor and the work was already there. Man, of course, had the garden there with all the briars and the thorns and other things that would make his life even harder, even though some of those were there, because man was dressed to keep it. And so there was dignity in that. And that's why God gave man the work, even after man fell. Notice in Genesis 3:19, he said, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and to dust shalt thou return." Genesis 3:19. So here you have, in this case, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. In other words, what was added to it was the toil and the laboring that it became harder to do, along with the briars and the thorns, which meant it was to be harder in the toil that man was to have. So here you find that God placed man in the garden and he was to work. Solomon used the ant to emphasize the urgency of labor. In Proverbs 6, verse 6 beginning, he said, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider her ways, which having no ruler, overseer, or guide, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the winter," or in the harvest. I still like to, and occasionally I do it. You may think it's kind of foolish to take a piece of bread and go out by an anthill and crumble the bread and watch them work. An ant will come out of the hole and they'll run into that piece of bread and they'll realize that's too big for me to handle. They'll take off back to the hole, and the first thing you know, here comes about 6 of them, right? You've probably done the same thing. They'll grab that piece of bread and they'll begin to work, and you don't know who the leader is. They don't have a leader. So what he did, he said, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, and consider her ways." Well, you saying to the lazy man, now you can learn something from that. She doesn't have a guide. She doesn't have an overseer. She doesn't have a ruler. Seems the nature of ants is they work together, but there's nobody's the boss, so to speak. But notice it says, "She provides her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest." Now the lesson emphasized there is that the ant's smart enough to know that there's a time you got to work, gather your food, put it there for the winter. That's in the summertime, that's in the harvest. And if you don't do it then, it's going to be too late in the wintertime. And so here he again is using the ant to teach the necessity of labor. Now I don't teach the necessity of labor to learn to labor at the proper time and in the proper way. And also you learn from the ant that in the laboring, people need to learn to work together. Well, I've seen little ants, and you have too if you've watched them much. You watch them and they'll grab a piece of bread or something that's twice or 3 times or a lot bigger than they are, and they'll pull and tug and work. And then the first thing you know, as I said, 4 or 5 will come along and they'll grab hold of that thing and they'll move it. They work together. So you can learn a lot from the ant. So he used that. And then, my friends, the law of labor is so fixed that it's either work or starve. Paul said in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, "For even when we're with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should eat." Now, the Bible principle is, we don't always practice it and believe it, at least we don't practice it. The Bible principle is that if a man's physically able to work and he's too lazy to work, we're not obligated to feed him. And when we feed people that are too lazy to work and won't work and depend on somebody else and expect somebody else to make their living for them, we're doing them wrong. That's not the thing to do. I repeat, the Bible principle is, if you don't work, you don't eat. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that there are people sometimes that are willing to work, that would work if they get a job, and they're trying to get a job, and they're willing to do anything they can, that still they can't get a job. Now, a person like that may need some help sometimes. But we're talking about somebody who's too lazy to work. The Bible principle is, you either work or starve. In other words, the principle that we learn here is that the way to overcome poverty is go to work. Not only that, but we need to learn that we must labor for what we have. The cat likes the fish, but hates the wading. A cat hates to wade in the water, but they like that fish. We like gold, but hate the digging. You see, my friends, there must be dignity in work because God worked. In Genesis 2 and verse 2 it says, and on the seventh day God ended his work. And God rested on the seventh day from all of his work which he had made. Now, God didn't rest because he's tired, but he had finished the work. He'd finished the work of creation. But the point is, God worked, and he ended his work. So the Bible teaches the necessity of labor and of employment. But secondly, man needs employment for his own good. Now, sometimes we may not think this, but just think about it. Man needs employment for strength of body and mind. Now, I mentioned to you this morning in illustrating a point that if you don't use a muscle, it withers and becomes useless. And so we need the labor and the employment for our muscles to build them, and also the mind that's not used will grow stale and will not be able to accomplish what God would have us accomplish. So we need labor, employment for the mind and body. Secondly, we need labor and employment because work makes the man. In other words, the farmer cultivates the crop, but the crop also cultivates the farmer. In the same way, we need to recognize that man may do the work, but work also helps to make the man. What we put into our work goes into us. If we put honesty into it, that's what goes into us. If we put dishonesty into it, that's what goes into us. So work we not only work, but it helps to make us what we ought to be or what we will be, either for good or for bad. Then third, my friends, one cannot really enjoy the sweetness of rest and sleep until one has tasted the bitterness of rigorous toil. For example, the wise man said in Ecclesiastes 5:12, the sleep of the laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not allow him to sleep. Now, what Solomon's pointing out is that the laboring man is able to sleep because he's tired. He's put himself into it. He's tired in body and mind. He can enjoy the sweetness of that rest and sleep. He might not have as much as some people, but he knows he's doing a worthwhile thing, but the abundance of the rich will not allow him to sleep. You've heard me say that Benjamin Franklin once said that the rich spend their first half of their life making what they have and the last half worrying about how to keep it. Now, he wasn't saying anything wrong with having abundance, but he was emphasizing the importance and the sweetness of rest and peace to those that labor. And then, my friends, it's needed because if we're not engaged in instructive work, idleness may cause us to be engaged in destructive work. For example, in 2 Thessalonians 3:11, Paul said, for we hear that there be some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. All right, now remember the 10th verse says, even when we commanded you that if any would not work, neither should eat. And then he says, we hear that there be some which walk among disorderly. Did you know, according to the Bible teaching, if there's an individual that's too lazy to work and you admonish him and he won't work, it's subject to withdrawal of fellowship from him? Have you ever heard of a church withdrawing fellowship from somebody who was too lazy to work? Yet, my friends, that's exactly what's being discussed in 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 15. The disorderly individual in this context, that's talked about through all those verses, is a man that wouldn't work. So Paul said in this particular case, we hear that there be some which walk among you disorderly. How, Paul? Working not at all, but are busybodies. Now notice, here's an individual that is not engaged in constructive work. He's idle, and as a result, it gives him time to become engaged in destructive practices. In this case, busybodies. You see, some people, some retired people, blight their life by spending their time in gossip and strife and turmoil. Idleness. And true, many times it's said idleness is the devil's workshop, but Paul recognized that a man that's idle doesn't have anything to do. He's not working. He can spend his time doing worthwhile things, or he can be a busybody. Now, who's a busybody? Well, Brother McGarvey used to say that a busybody is an individual who has business, but he's always minding everybody else's business. A busybody in everybody else's affair. You know, in many places you'll have individuals that it will be said of them, if you want to know something, go check on them. They know what's going on in town all the time. They keep up with everything. There's a lady in Jackson a number of years ago that she made more phone calls. I'll bet, if I wanted to bet money, that she spent at least 4 hours every day on the telephone. And I'm not exaggerating. She called about everybody in town, especially members of the church. And she was very sly the way she'd go about it. She was really concerned about people and about their health and about welfare. But what she wanted to find out was what is going on. And she pretty well kept up with everything that's going on. She was a busybody. And yet while she was doing much of this, in her case, it worked the other way. She had a job. But at night when she got home, she'd get on the telephone. But now just think about when she retired, and she did retire, and now her health's bad, but she still makes the phone calls and knows what's going on. That's a busybody. So let me repeat what I said. Man needs employment because if you're not engaged in constructive activities, idleness will give you time to be engaged in destructive activities. But then, my friends, what are the characteristics of a good employee? First, a good employee sees not only the work that he does, but also what it does for others. In other words, I must see my work as a part of the overall work of the world. It enhances what I accomplish in life. If I just see my little world and what I'm working at, that's all. I don't see how it relates to other people and how it relates to their life and how it relates to my helping them and all. If I just see my little world, the work I do, then what I accomplish will not be as great and not mean as much to me and to other people. So the good worker sees not only what he does, but also what it does for others. Secondly, the good worker is enthusiastic. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 9:10, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. Paul said in Colossians 3:23, and whatsoever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men. A good worker is enthusiastic in his or her work. A banker once stood before his employees and he said, ladies and gentlemen, there's no substitute for brains. But if you could substitute anything for brains, it would be enthusiasm. Another banker is supposed to have said, I doubt that he said this, but it's reported, he said, you can leave your brains at home, but the day you leave your enthusiasm at home, you're fired. Well, what he was emphasizing was there needs to be enthusiasm in your work. In whatever you do, you need to be enthusiastic about it. Then third, my friends, a good worker recognizes, and here is a vital point. A good worker recognizes that I'm not working for myself or for you. I'm working for the Lord. And if you don't believe that'll change your attitude towards your job, it will. Let me call your attention in Colossians 3. Paul, in this particular case, is talking about the employer-employee relationship. And notice what he says: servants or employees, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that the Lord you shall receive the reward. Now hold that thought and look in Ephesians 6. Paul said, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart as unto Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall receive the Lord, whether he be bond or free. Now, when Paul talked about the servant-master relationship, they actually had servants and masters. You have the principles of the employer-employee relationship. So Paul makes the statement here. He says in the first place, if you do something, do it heartily. Be enthusiastic about it. Put yourself into it. But also to recognize that you're doing it as to the Lord. In other words, we recognize that our work is to the Lord, and that helps us to see that Christianity is not just coming in here on 10 o'clock on Sunday morning and leaving at 12 and coming back at 5. Christianity is involved in the whole of life, in our work, in our play, whatever we do. It's involved in the job you have. And if you are just doing your job just to please your boss, you won't be near as good as an employee as you will if you're doing your job to please the Lord. Because Paul said it's to be to the Lord, not with eye service as men pleasers. In other words, as long as the boss is around, this employee is a good employee. But when he's gone, he'll fool around and waste time and so forth. You see, if you realize I'm working for the Lord, that'll never happen where the bosses are not there, because the Lord's going to see you all the time. So Paul said in this case, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as to the Lord. In other words, he's simply emphasizing you're not just working to get a paycheck, because it's the Lord that's going to reward you. So the way you work, the way I work, is going to have a part in determining the reward we receive of the Lord. Now, the man we're working for may give us a paycheck, and that's all we're working for. That is, we're working for begin Monday morning and Friday night again. If that's all you're working for, a paycheck, you'll not be as good of an employee, I repeat, as you would be if you're working for the Lord. And a Christian's working for the Lord. So we need to recognize this principle that Paul's talking here, because that's one of the characteristics of a good employee, a good worker. Then again, my friends, a good worker, or another characteristic is happy in his work. If you're not happy in the job you have, you ought to try to change jobs as quickly as you can. Now, in today's society, you may want to look around before you do that, because jobs are not that plentiful right now. But what I'm saying is, a good employee is happy in his work. A personnel man a few months ago asked 100 employees of the company, how many of you are happy in what you're doing? 100 of them. 5 hands went up. 5 hands. He said, what's wrong, fellas? I don't get enough pay. I'm not interested in what I'm doing. I took this job till something better came along. Now, my friends, it's estimated by some sources that 75% of the workforce in this country is producing 50% of their capacity. If that be true, that means a lot of people are whining, that are being overpaid, that are whining about wanting better jobs. In other words, just think about it. Here's 100 people and only 5 are happy in what they're doing. An employee that's not happy in what he's doing is not really going to be the very best employee. In other words, what we need to recognize is it's not necessarily liking what we do or doing, let me turn that around. It's not necessarily doing what we like, but liking what we have to do many times. In other words, don't you do things sometimes that you don't particularly like to do? But how much better it'll be and how much more you'll enjoy it if you learn to like what you have to do. And we all have to do that sometimes. We have to learn to like what we have to do. So a good employee is happy in his work. Then again, my friends, a good employee is honest. In Romans 12:17, Paul said, providing things honest in the sight of all men. In Ephesians 4:28, let him that stole steal no more. So here you have a principle: a good employee is honest. Now that can work in several ways. He's honest in the sense that if he's supposed to give 8 hours of work, that's what he gives. If he's supposed to get a 10-minute break, that's what he takes, 10 minutes. Not 12, not 11, not 15, he takes 10. Now my friends, I want to ask you a question. If you're supposed to take a 10-minute break and you take 12, you've stolen 2 minutes from the company. If not, why not? You say, but preacher, 2 minutes. Or suppose the company's got 500 employees. Multiply the 500 times 2 and you'll see how many hours a day and how many hours a week they steal from the company. And that puts many companies out of business. But the principle behind it is simply this. An employee is honest. And what I'm saying is that if you are going to give an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. You don't fool around, you don't lag around. I'm glad that I learned this principle a long time ago. I don't punch a time clock like some of you do. But ever since I've been preaching, I've made it a practice that I spend 8 to 10 hours a day doing something. And when I say that, when I was in full-time work, working with the congregation all the time, I spent 8 or 10 hours a day either studying, visiting, or doing something. Because, not that the elders are watching me all the time and saying you punch a time clock and say when you did this and that, but the point is, I was working for the Lord. Now somebody says, now preacher, that's right, you're working for the Lord, but I'm not working for the Lord. Yes, you are, if you're a Christian. You may not be preaching, you may not be teaching, but if you're at a job and you're working at it, then you're working for the Lord. And once we recognize that, we'll be a different type of employee. And then, my friends, a good employee produces. There will always be a place for an employee that produces. A company will always find a place for a person like that. And a good employee is one that uses his mind. I have a little saying that I wrote down that somebody wrote a number of years ago that goes like this. A person should put think in the place before the man, why he fails. There's many an industrious man who never gets ahead because he does not think or plan, but trust to luck instead. He's not a slacker or shirk, this plotter in life's grind. But though he always minds his work, he never works his mind. So a good worker uses his mind. And so what you have is this statement. The good worker's like a good watch. Open face, busy hands, pure gold, well regulated and wound up. The problem of employment. And I hope that each of us will learn some principles here that will help us to be a better employee or employer, because the employer has a responsibility too. But if you're here tonight and haven't obeyed the gospel, you're convinced that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, you're ready to turn in repentance, confess his name before men, be baptized in the remission of your sins. Won't you do that while we stand and while we sing?